thank you for returning with us for our next keynote address. I would like to introduce Mr. Andy Brunelle, recently retired from the Forest Service and an important strategic partner and board member on the Andrus Center Board of Governors. Andy will be introducing Governor Brad Little. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Emily. I get the privilege here to introduce Governor Little, and it's a return engagement for the governor. He was last at the Andrus Conference in 2019, our Energy, Salmon, Agriculture, and Community Can We Come Together conference. I dug in a little deeper into some of our archives at the Andrus Center, and looking back, he's been at an Andrus conference many times. In fact, if we were Saturday Night Live, Brad would be a 5-timer club member. So how did this happen? In my mind, it goes back to a young Brad Little representing Idaho wool growers, American sheep industry, stockmen, and an even younger Andy Brunelle before I had gray hair as a staffer to Governor Andrus, and meetings in the governor's office where Governor Little, then Brad Little, was definitely stood out as an effective, capable advocate for the livestock interests in this state, and was constructive in suggestions and approaches to some of the problems we faced in Idaho back in the late 80s, early 1990s. And so the governor took notice of that. And as time went on, when the Andrus Center was established and we began having these conferences nearly every year, there were a lot of times, and I can remember sitting around the planning meetings where we would say, let's get Brad Little for that panel. He'll be a good, effective advocate for and be able to speak to that issue. I also saw it firsthand in working with Governor Little on the Foothills Open Space Management Plan. So you've heard a lot about the levy election in 2001, where Boise voters voted a $10 million bond to protect open space. Well, there was a precursor to that, which was if we are going to protect open space and acquire it as a city, we need to have a management plan. And Brad Little, as a livestock permittee on the Boise front, was there at the table, along with many others. I was there as a federal agency representative. A young staffer, Scott Martin, was part of that effort as well. So seeing it firsthand definitely was an impression that I had, and I think that Governor Andrus had as well. And so digging back, I found in one of the older conference programs, something that I thought would be appropriate today that I'll read, about Brad Little, Little Land and Livestock, Emmett, Idaho. Owner and operator of a farming and ranching operation in southwest Idaho, well known for his ability to work with everyone around the table and to articulate the cause of responsible use of public lands. And all I can say to that is keep it up. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the charter member of the Andrus Conference 5-Timers Club, Governor Brad Little.
Well, Brunelle, you don't take directions any better now than you did back then about a brief introduction, but I do wonder where my jacket is, my 5-Timers jacket. So, yes, I have been, I was actually 7 years old when I started doing this, so you don't make any assumptions about how old I am. Governor Andrus and I used to agree to disagree on, but it was interesting. We probably started off that way, but as we both got older, we found out that the agreement pool got bigger and the disagreement got smaller. And these conferences, I remember we had a great conference on fire one time, and I stated that my ancestors in the sheep business used to set the forest on fire when they left. The loggers were not big fans of that, but and I think Jamie Pinkham, I can't remember which one of the tribal members was there. And we got done, and he says, "Well, it was your ancestors, my ancestors, who used to burn. We haven't burned ever since." I think his were a little more effective than we were, but I mean, I have enjoyed the opportunities I've had, and I still miss, you know, iconic figures like Cease Andrus. Something will happen, and you'll go, "I wonder what Cease would have thought," or I don't know whether Cease would agree with me or disagree with me, but the one thing I always knew is he'd tell me what his position was and what mine was. But, you know, you look at the history of this conference and what we've talked about, and, you know, the common goal always is how do you create an atmosphere for people to get things done. And it's interesting, it wasn't in my, because my staff doesn't know some of my history, but the Boise front up here is really interesting because when I was very young, there was nothing, there was no management up there. And whether it be kids partying at night, whether it be people dumping trash, and you got to remember that there were 500 Army horses, there were about 2,000 head of cattle, and probably 20,000 head of sheep that migrated across the Boise front. And in probably climatological conditions like these out here, and you can still Google Boise flood 1950. Nobody old enough to remember. I think it was like 1956 or something, because the range condition up there was so bad. We had a fire, and then well, if you go up there, you can still see the terraces that they built in the 50s as a result of that. But literally, the entire Boise front came down into town, and St. Luke's Hospital is engineered, has been engineered since then to make sure it wasn't in the flood path. We put all those big retention ponds. But the big issue is it got pretty bad, and then it got everybody to the table. And some of the problems that you're talking about are multi-agency problems. Well, down here, we've got some municipal property. Then we've got a swath of private land with, there used to be 20, now there's probably 5 or 6 landowners. Then there's some state land, then there's BLM land, then there's a bunch of Forest Service ground, then there's Army Corps land, and this isn't that big of a piece of real estate. It depends on what state you're from, but in Idaho, it's not that big of a piece of real estate. We literally did get everybody together, and Andy talked about the bond issue that in fact Lauren came to run that program for that. I thought, how are you going to get people that don't live on the north end to assess themselves to buy ground right out their back door? And I was proven wrong. I said, well, I'm not much interested in it, but I see what you're trying to do. But the public did have a chance in it. But since then, and the city in particular has taken a lead role, and everybody that utilizes it took a lead role up there. I mean, there were people up there tearing the ground up. There were parties up there all the time, and now the discipline and the appreciation for it. But that is a good model for what we need to do in a lot of other places. But up there now, you have the people that live there that the minute somebody starts to do something wrong, the police or the sheriff or somebody else gets a call, and it really is a success story. And after a couple of the big fires, we did some seeding up there, and I can tell you from my experience, the resiliency of the ecosystem up there to tolerate public use, fire, fill in the blank, is vastly better than it was 50 years ago, 80 years ago. You'd have to go because Fort Boise was the Army fort, and that's why it's called the the Fort Boise Reserve, because that's where the Army kept all their horses, and they were here all year round. But anyway, that was kind of my experience when you talk about big problems that you think you can't fix, that we did fix. My goal, everybody knows, from Idaho is to make Idaho a place where our children choose to stay. And when I first got that job, that was my goal. Now everybody else's kids want to come here, and that's a different issue. But I'm just watching the news, and there were riots in Chicago, and I said, well, that's part, and problems in Seattle, problems in Los Angeles, problems in Chicago, and I says, that doesn't help me while I'm trying to ration people coming into the state. And it continues to be that way. But we all know, particularly those of you in this room, we all know that our outdoor opportunities, particularly given the fact that 60 to 67% of the land in Idaho is public land that's available. We all know about that. Now the issue is, where do we get the resources and the management to be able to tolerate higher populations for particular times of year. Being a rural person, one of the things that's really important is, we can maintain the trails, and we can put in the campsites. But what do you do with Boise County and all these rural counties that have to provide the law enforcement, the fire, the police, everything else out there? And I know going forward that's going to be an issue, because everybody from right now, they're not clamoring to get up there, but they will pretty soon. And as we try and preserve the opportunities that are out there, how do we help with that superstructure that's out there? And that's always been a challenge, and it will be a challenge going forward. When I went through the pandemic, and I was just up at Coeur d'Alene and Moscow yesterday, I remember my buddy Jay Inslee had the state of Washington law clear down, and I went up there. We were giving out lunches at the Kroc Center in Coeur d'Alene, and I casually said something about requiring people from the state of Washington to have a visa to come across the state line, and the crowd went crazy. I mean, they were filling up the campgrounds, they were filling up the beaches, they were filling up the golf courses, and that was a triggering event, because our state parks and our outdoors, and even the people that own industrial timberland, just got besieged. I think Susan's, our numbers, we went up 20% a year, the parks have, but the utilization of all those lands has gone way up, which is going to precipitate us having to make investments going forward. This year we had I assume Susan loves to talk about this. She talked about the $100 million in new revenue, most of it for maintenance, but there's quite a bit of it for capacity, and then there's some of it ongoing to what do we do to build capacity going forward. And it's good that we're getting that maintenance backlog taken care of as we go forward, because I was at Hell's Canyon Park yesterday, and there's a lot going on. A lot of the parks and I appreciate the fact that the legislature gave us spending authority. If we don't get it spent all this year, we can do it next year to do that necessary maintenance as part of our Idaho First plan. Some of the other things we've done in the last 2 years is significant investments in water, both quantity and quality. We're doing subsurface water projects. We're doing surface water projects. And then I'm making it snow outside in the end of April. But we're making some pretty big investments this year. We were just talking a minute ago about, we've still got some water things to basically solve as agriculture, municipalities, recreation need more water, it's hard to get people to talk about it in a year where the river's running like it is out there right now, but it's still necessary this year. Matter of fact, I would argue now is a better time to do it than in a year of shortage, because you can be a little more forward thinking about some of the projects we need to do. But there's, we've in the last 2 years, it'll be $400 million that went into those areas. And then on the water quality side, we started this a couple years ago. Coeur d'Alene Lake, which is a very precious part of the state of Idaho, I appointed a committee there that's doing great work and making recommendations about water quality issues there. As the Kootenai County area grows, and that lake is pretty delicate because of all the heavy metals that are in the bottom of that lake from our legacy mining industry. We can't be just a little right. We got to be a lot right in what we do to preserve that jewel in the state of Idaho. And I'm very pleased that diverse group that's making recommendations, you talk about collaboration, there's a great example. Developers, city officials, DEQ, conservation people are all coming together collectively. There's some money that's going to go to some of the municipalities up there to upgrade their sewer systems so that their wastewater is not exacerbating the imbalance, the chemical imbalance of that lake. And I'm very pleased with that. We're doing recharge, obviously, in the eastern Idaho Plain, the Palouse Basin. And one of the things that got funded this year is a result of our salmon working group. The unanimous recommendations is a new pipe out of Dvorak to bring cold water into those fish hatcheries. And we think we're going to get about it's going to yield about 1.6 million more in smolts. And that was a unanimous agreement, and we've got more things to do there. We're working on CAFO, BMP, WACPA, all of those things. And then, of course, always fire. We put a lot of money into fire in the last few years, and that's going to be a continuous issue. I had a land board meeting this morning, and we were talking about investments in fire. That's basically what we're doing as we look forward, going along. And but in some of these areas, they're what I'd call a sticky wicket, and we're going to have to get people together to bang their heads together and come up with conclusions. But as I cited, we've got some examples in Idaho, the Henry's Lake area, here on the Boise front. We can do this, but it's never real easy. But if it's not easy, the results of it are usually more beneficial. So with that, what are you going to do? Stump the chump?
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful rundown. We have a few questions, and we have some runners from the audience. If people want to put up their written down questions, they can bring them up to me. But let's go ahead and get started with recreation funding round 2. So we heard from Susan this morning and you just now about the backlog of maintenance and what you intend to use that money for. What does the next round of investment look like for recreation in particular?
Well, I tell you, one of the challenges, and I see Director Miller just walked in here a minute ago, is our state lands, and we have that constitutional, the land board fiduciary responsibility. We got to figure out some way to leverage those lands to continue to generate funding for the beneficiaries, but also to maximize recreational opportunities. But whether it's state land, whether we're helping our BLM and Forest Service partners, or whether it's industrial timberland or other large landowners, how do we incentivize and leverage that to create more capacity? Because my parks can't handle, and Susan's parks can't handle. We've got to build capacity elsewhere, and it's got to be sustainable. So I think that's going to be some of the, and I failed to talk about what we've done on the federal level with Good Neighbor and shared stewardship. Governor Bullock was real involved with Governor Otter and the Western governors when we put that in. Idaho was the first to adopt it. I think Montana was second. And that's a good model. So if we take our shared stewardship, good neighbor model and use it for expanding access, I think we'll get a pretty good return on investment.
Wonderful, thank you. We have an audience question here that's a follow-up on our discussion this morning. Will Idaho ever have a state office of outdoor recreation?
I'm shocked I got that question. Well, you know, I know, did you have one, Steve, in Montana? Yeah. And well, you haven't changed a damn bit. And I'm not opposed to it, but I don't want to add. I mean, the Department of Parks is the lead, but you've got wildlife interests, which is fish and game, and then you got the real estate interest, which is lands. I think we can do it by everybody getting together, but I sure as hell wouldn't veto the bill if it came to me. But you may not know that I'm not a big government guy. And I think the existing agencies ought to do their job and expand it. But I'm not opposed to it. But I can see where it would be, oh, we can't, I don't want to address that as director of Fish and Game or lands or parks, because that's that other guy's job. And I want us to work to do the right thing. And if that does it, but I know if Steve says it's great, it's got to be great. So.
We've got another question from the audience here about the Great Snake River, which is not swimmable or fishable in places.
Sure as hell not fishable today.
How will you help us to restore this important recreation asset?
Well, actually, some of those water investments that we're doing in you know, and there's no secret about it. Most of the issues with the snake are runoff, and there's some great projects being done, particularly in the Magic Valley. We need to leverage that up. We're going to redo the Farm Bill. I think, and I've argued this for years. People in the United States, we got enough wheat, we got enough corn. What people want is we need to leverage Farm Bill dollars for incentives to people. Real incentives for people to do the right thing, because you know, it doesn't take much in the way, and there's users all over the state, farmers all over the state that are doing that, that the water that leaves their ground is just damn near as clean as the water that went on it to begin with, and we need to do that. So I think a combination of those programs leveraged up by federal Farm Bill dollars will get us a long way there. But it's, I mean, the Snake River has been the backbone of the state of Idaho for a long time, and to transform it overnight, and like I said, this year with abundant water, we really have the opportunity to do some things to where what goes onto a piece of property when it goes off should be pretty close to the same water quality, and that has not been the standard in the past. And I think most people would rather pay people to do that than they would for a wheat subsidy or a corn subsidy or fill in the blank. And it would still, the revenue would still flow to the farmers, but the incentive, instead of to create 10 bushels more wheat, would be to have the water come off cleaner. So.
Very good, thank you. I don't think this audience would let me off the hook if I didn't ask you about salmon. And this audience member says that the critical role that salmon play in bringing nutrients, sustenance, and value to Idaho's forests, public lands, and communities, would you consider championing their restoration and breaching the lower snake dams before it's too late?
Let me answer the first question. Would I champion their recovery? Yes. Would I champion taking out the dams? No.
Cease would have wanted you to. Last question from the audience. Should Idaho increase funding for outdoor recreation if it takes new or increased taxes? If not, what's an alternative solution?
We're getting a lot done. I mean, I don't... let me introduce some of you to the Idaho legislature. We can get it done, And I mean, we can, but I will tell you, if you said we're going to have a great big new tax for something, then they're going to say, how's that going to work? I think we got enough tools that are available to us to increase outdoor recreation with people getting together and working on these projects, rather than there is to create a new bureaucracy. Some point in time, you know, you're going to have to address that. But we can get a lot done right now with the tools we have. And when we max that out, then you know, the Boise Front up here is a good example. You know, I remember talking to the mayor about it. It's $10 million to buy those critical pieces to maintain the trail system. You can do it with writing a check, and you can do it with putting other incentives out there. Let's look at all the incentives before we write a check.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, Governor, for coming to the Andrus Conference and talking with us about outdoor recreation. We hope you'll come back, and we appreciate your insights.
You're welcome.
Very good. We'll take a 15-minute break and then get out onto the trails and the rivers with our partners and user groups next. Thank you.